Good morning, everybody. Before I begin, I wanted to honestly say that when I got this invitation, I was very disinclined to join you. Yes, it's fantastic to hear my colleagues from around the world, to be nurtured by the intellectual prowess, their socio-political sensitivities, their art historical knowledge, the great challenges that they've overcome to establish extraordinary cultural traditions wherever they have to be working in. But when I read the title of the conference, this idea of globalism for somebody from Africa is so problematic, because I often think about whose globe. Is it the globe which prefers or advantages Europe and North America and morphs the world into a territory where we're very far away? We're not represented for the land mass that we are, nor that humanity began where I find myself. So what I decided to do was to come, but not to present a formal paper. What I wanted to do was just to share with you some anecdotal stories. And why am I doing this? Because I think at some point, those of us from Africa, whether we have been there for generations, whether we are there because of the history of colonialism, as in my case, or whether we're there by choice through very recent immigration, I think we've become extremely tired of a narrative that speaks for us. And how do we as Africans not disrupt this narrative? How do we admit and accept it's no longer relevant for us, and it's not a narrative that we want to participate in necessarily, and it's not a narrative that we either want to reject necessarily? Perhaps we'd like to make this narrative irrelevant. Now, when I do my presentation about the museum that we're building, you're going to see all the marks of what a traditional museum is. And I'm sure when I sit down, you're all going to attack me for saying, well, you have all these ideas and your outcomes are exactly the same as what we do. And I think that that's the problematic of how we find ourselves on my continent. Because we participate in a narrative that's been written by outsiders. You'll notice I'm trying to invert that we're not the outsiders, that you are. I was just recently on a panel in Art Basel, and a gentleman from Kenya put up his hand and he said, why the hell are you building this museum in Cape Town? It's so far away from everything. And I kind of thought myself, no, you're so far away from us. And I really think that what I became deeply aware of in the last 2 days of listening to these conversations as well is that I've seen initiatives like this so many times. There's conferences, there's discussions, there's an invitation for a couple of people from Africa to join you, and then there's an exhibition, which lands up being very much like every exhibition that we see coming out of Africa. And then, as my colleague Yella and I were laughing last night, enough has been done. And then we can move on. And we can play in another arena, whether that's China or South America or Leipzig or Los Angeles. And so I thought to myself, by participating, is it possible that I just re-entrench this very system over and over again. Last night when I was lying in bed, I thought, well, how do we change it? If we attempt to disrupt this narrative, it means that perhaps we can't just rely on some exhibition of the decorative artifacts of a place that we've all discussed, and that's it. Perhaps we have to take account of the globalism, and excuse my language, but that fucked Africa up. All of our engagements on that continent, including the removal of cultural heritage without permission. I refer to the Benin bronzes. The removal en masse of natural resources. And now, yet again, because of the financial prowess of international museums, and I'm not sure in the German-speaking world, but definitely in the Anglo-speaking world, Africa is extremely hot right now. So everybody wants to buy Africa and show Africa and engage with Africa. And sadly, because of this newfound interest, all the artifacts of Africa are yet again leaving our continent. So you might think, well, this strange fat man seems very naive in his approach. But you see, I'm trying to be really practical about this. When I was younger growing up, I couldn't understand why the art history that we were taught at university spent one day on my continent, maybe one lecture on Asia, and the rest of the time we studied Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Renaissance, European traditions. I couldn't understand that. I couldn't understand why when I went to our public museums, I didn't see any representation of Africa. All I saw was representations of what was considered the founding nations of my country. So our Nationalgalerie took as a founding principle that they needed to represent the Netherlands, Germany, France, and England. It was only in the 1970s, in fact, that we saw artists, black artists from South Africa starting to be represented in our national museums. Whether what I'm saying is factually correct or not is beside the point, to be honest. Because recently when I was reading the ICOM guidelines for ethics, it didn't say what your museum necessarily only does. They emphasized the perception of your museum by your audience, by your community. And that hit me really hard because I realized as we begin to build this monster museum in Cape Town, we have no outcomes or paradigms which have really taken this head on and given us outcomes or solutions whereby my continent is part of the equal narrative in writing the history of culture on our continent. So I grew up at the height of apartheid. I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that the end of colonialism only ended about 22, 23 years ago in my country. And in that period, the thing that became the most contested was obviously your racial classification. And as a result of that, one of the things that are being played out now in our public museums is the right to representation and the right to cultural access. And so, as an institution, we had to think really long and hard about how do we deal with this. And it became very clear to me that we couldn't come in with a prescriptive nature. We couldn't come in with a curatorial vision. We couldn't come in with a predetermined or prescriptive defined approach. What we'd have to do is respond. We'd have to respond to what the community brings up, how they critique us, how they attack us, how they question what we do in our right to do it, who it will represent, how it will function, how it will be funded. And so as we move, almost responding almost in real time to what that community is saying to us. Now you might say, well, that must be a difficult situation because you can't take an institutional position. And what I want to share is how, in the building of the building, we've specifically set things up not to necessarily have an institutional position. We've set things up so that there is contradiction, there's place for dissent, there's place for chaos, and there's no place for one authoritative voice to define a narrative or a recording of history. Now, are we going to get this right? Most probably not. But we're going to do it in a way which is really open, which is really high profile, and it's going to be critiqued as we go along. And I only think that in the next 10 to 20 years, will we see if this experiment has any validity or not. Now, it would be so much easier for me to come to you all, a highly intellectual audience, and sell my project to you. But the problem is I can't, because I'm stuck in a cultural history, in a recording of visual arts, which is impossible for somebody in Africa to negotiate. Because as I say, that globe preferences you and not us. And I suppose the great challenge in the outcomes of these kinds of conferences is to what extent, if you choose to engage with us, how holistically you do that. I'll give you an example. During the end of apartheid, we were not sure if LGBTI rights would be written into our constitution or not. As you know, they were. So there was an attempt by the visual art community to try really hard to bring the subject to the fore as much as possible. And an exhibition was mounted called Gay Rights, Rights and Rewrites. And in my research around this exhibition recently, what was astounding for me was that the majority of artists included in the exhibition were not gay. They were established artists recognized by the system. And for lack of time, I can't really go into how that system is established. And this was pretty astounding for me. At the moment at our National Museum, we have another situation like this playing itself out. Like is fashionable all over the world. Let's take account of our inadequacies. Let's take account of the things that we didn't insert into this monster called art history. So let's do an exhibition about women artists. So they put up an exhibition, and they include an artist who's currently in a legal judgment for killing a sex worker. And he's included in an exhibition about women's work. So, of course, the sex workers of Cape Town, they have a union, all come and protest in front of the museum. The museum is in panic because are they going to rush into the museum and start burning artworks or destroying artworks? And it's just astounding for me how, and this is where I take responsibility for the problematic of this conversation myself, is how inadequately we are prepared to deal with these kinds of situations. The fact is that curators are not even preempting these problems. We're not even sensitive enough to know, should we emphasize freedom of speech or should we emphasize hate speech? Should we remove the respect of an individual or should we remove the right of an artist? And we're caught in a situation where I don't think we could have understood with the euphoria of the end of apartheid or the euphoria of Mr. Mandela that we would eventually come to our senses and start realizing that this is a lot more complex, a lot more difficult, a lot more contested, a lot more charged. And we were not, I don't think any of us have the tools to be able to deal with this. Why am I saying this? Because my challenge to you is if we are going to get involved in these global debates, we haven't even figured them out where we are. So to come in from the outside and to have any comprehension of it is going to be difficult. You're going to be seen as an outsider. People are going to be suspicious of your intentions, etc. So what I'm going to do now is maybe just show you a few images. So this is an old grain silo in Cape Town. It's about 100 years old. It was the central collection depot for grain from across the country, which was then distributed back to Europe. Remember that Zimbabwe and South Africa were two of the grain baskets of the world in the early 20th century. The reason why we chose this building was we felt that by building a traditional museum with great stairs and lions and columns, etc., we were creating a kind of prescriptive nature of what a museum should look like and how it should be negotiated. So we decided in 2008 to build this project, and you might say to yourself, well, this is a very big project. It's the size of the exhibition space is the size of the Tate Modern, just to give an example of comparison. It's 9 floors of galleries. Our strategy was that we wanted to preserve some of the artifacts of Africa for Africa in Africa. Sounds kind of like a marketing campaign. Why? I've spoken that before about how our cultural heritage has been extracted. So we just felt that one of the most quantifiable actions that we could do is to say, we're going to be sure that the seminal moments of our history are accessible by people from our continent. That was the first. The second was that we needed this level of scale because up until now, cultural representation has been a highly contested issue. During the apartheid years, not only were these museums, our public museums, representing a very small minority's cultural production, but also they were not accessible to the majority of our population. Although, in fact, most people could have walked in, they just didn't because of the way it was set up. So we felt that we needed real scale so that there was enough space to allow for the representation for a multiplicity of concerns, a multiplicity of artists, and a multiplicity of art approaches. The other thing that we've done is we've devised the museum so that it's not within the traditional mode of different departments, painting, sculpture, drawing, etc. But we've established independent institutions within the museum besides the kind of permanent collection and temporary exhibition rooms. And each of these institutions have their own staff. So that means that me as the museum director, if I have a certain vision, the person in the Institute for Photography or the Institute for the Moving Image can make a completely contradictory decision and actually have completely contradictory programming to what I would like. And I think, again, yesterday it was fascinating for me listening to one of my colleagues or somebody making a comment about bringing collections together. So instead of separating them by anthropology and science and art. And for us, in a way, it's that separation of things that's going to guarantee some diversity, some kind of difference, and the break-in of an authoritative voice. There's many other interventions that I can talk about, but I'm running out of time. One other thing that we're very excited about is that there's no public space that's not accessible. There's no private space that's not accessible, except one section of our storage, which is works on loan. So no person who works in the museum actually works in an office. We all work in the public space. Literally, the curator sits there and the registrar sits there. And there's a couple of spaces where there's like little glass facades where you can work behind if you need to make a private telephone call. Other than that, we want to almost open up the functioning of the museum, not some kind of intellectual, conceptual thing, just to say to our community, this is yours, you deserve to know how it functions, how the decisions are made, who's making those decisions, why are things included and not included, etc., etc. So we're very excited about, I'm going to just show you one or two more images. This is an atrium, which is about twice the height of the Louvre Pyramid. It's about 13 stories high, where we'll commission, or we have commissioned, large-scale interventions. The one thing, unfortunately, that we deal with in my country is that because, to a large extent, museums have been excluded in the day-to-day activities of the majority of our population, we need to find ways to engage them. And so we've been going through really intense staff training, looking at the ways that, in fact, retail would be welcoming to literally service-based industries, the way that we deal with the public. Also, we've had to try and look at things which perhaps our audience would be comfortable reading. So technology-based practice, moving image, digital, video, film, and interactive-based practice, so sound or performative-based traditions. It's a piece by Nicholas Globo. You'll see the galleries themselves are pretty standard Bauhaus white cubes, so we have appropriated where necessary. So I'm going to end there. What does this mean? I'm not actually quite sure. When journalists ask me, what do you hope your museum to be in 10 years and 20 years and 50 years? My response to them is, we will have succeeded if it's not prescriptive. And that's all I can say. Thank you.